So here are the 26 letters of the alphabet. By the way, that's going to be on the test. That's a very important concept for today's presentation. We need to know that there's 26 letters in the alphabet. And in the case of this cipher, all I'm doing is I'm adding 4 letters to each letter. So for the letter A, B, C, D, E. Okay, so A is mapped to E, and then B to F, etc., all the way to Z, which is now D. And now, I don't have to send a code book with my ship and in the War Department. All I have to do is, everybody has to just know what the cipher is for the day or the week or the month, whatever it happens to be. And in this case, if both sides have this alphabet plus 4 understanding, now they can send the same encrypted message, and it looks a little different. The M is mapped to Q, the Y is mapped to C, and away you go. My name is Richard. And then, of course, he gets it on the other end and decodes it. And of course, unless someone knows what the cipher code is, well, now you have a secret. So that is the essence of what a code and what a cipher is. And as a result of the fact that you now know that, you're all now been drafted into the government's communications headquarters, which is called the GCHQ. The bus for that is also leaving after today's presentation. But remember, this is in England, and if any of you have been to England, even in the summer, you better pack for rainy weather. So that's an important thing to do. All right, so the next thing I want to talk to you about is probability. We're not going to have to do very much math. You don't have to understand any math for today, but understanding some pretty simple concepts is important for the Enigma machine understanding. Here it is. The probability of winning the Powerball, the lottery. There was just a huge lottery yesterday. What was it, $1.6 billion? I didn't win, by the way. I'm still eager, though, because I still want to talk to you guys, so, even if I had one. The probability of winning the Powerball, 1 in 292 million. The probability of picking a perfect bracket. Now, what's a perfect bracket? If anyone has watched March Madness in March, there's 64 teams. They play 63 games. And there is a contest from time to time of picking a perfect bracket. In fact, Warren Buffett had a contest with all his employees. He said, I will pay $1 million if someone picks a perfect bracket, which means for every 2 teams that play, they pick the winning team all the way to the end. He'd pay him $1 million. What's the probability of that, you might ask? How about 1 in 9 million? Do you think he had much risk of giving away his $1 million? What a joke. A total joke, right? All for publicity. Okay, now what about the probability of cracking a 4-wheel Enigma? Well, this is a shocking number. This is why the Germans thought it was uncrackable. The probability of stumbling onto the solution was 158 million to 1. No way would you think that someone was going to be able to crack that. But shockingly, they were smart enough to figure out how to do it. And we're going to talk about how that happened. So this is the machine. This is a 3-wheeled Enigma. These are the wheels. Don't worry, we're going to look at the number of different pictures of this so you'll get a better understanding. This one's not actually all that clear. This is actually what one of the wheels looks like. It has 26 letters on both sides. And interestingly enough, the way they did this is that if the A was on this position on the other side, it was wired to a completely different letter on the other side. And they had 3 different wheels. And they put them into that machine in different orders on different days. So the way this thing worked is that they basically had a QWERTY typewriter. Just like the typewriter you use today, only it was modified for European letters. So not every letter is in exactly the same spot as your typewriter on your keyboard. But that's the letter A. And when you pushed the letter A, the signal traveled down and through the machine. It came out the front through what we call the plug board. It then went around the side and through these 3 Enigma wheels. It then hit something called a reflector. It was bounced back, came back through the plug board, and lit up a light bulb. These are all light bulbs on the top. And that's the basic way it works. Here's another picture of it. A slightly clearer picture with the lid open. So these are the light bulbs. Those are the 3 wheels. This is the typewriter part, and this is the part that we call the plug board. And again, it worked in a very simple yet very complicated manner. When you push the letter A, the signal transferred all the way through the machine, through the wheels, back this way, and it lit up a light bulb. And then what happened is that this wheel clicked 1 time. If you hit the letter A again, then it would light up a different light, and this wheel would click one time. There were 26 positions on the wheel. After it clicked 26 times, on the 27th click, this wheel would click one time. Then you'd go through this whole setting again and click this after another 26 letters, this would click again. After this wheel clicked 26 times, this wheel would click one time. So there was an infinite number of possibilities, which is how that number that I just showed you was created. Again, here's a four-wheeled Enigma. So as the war went on, the Germans decided that they would throw caution to the wind, probably because the military contractor that sold them the three-wheeled Enigma figured out he could sell them a new machine. And that's how it would work in our military. I'm sure it was like that in the German military too. Anyway, they ended up with a four-wheel Enigma. And in this particular case, they had to put these four wheels into the right slots. But it worked exactly the same way. The same keyboard, the plug board on the front, and this is actually the plate that covered the lights. So these are what the lights all look like. Not very complicated. In this little compartment here was the battery that ran the whole thing. And what they did with these machines is that they gave one to every operating unit in the German Army, the German Navy, and the German Air Force. Everybody had one of these machines. Everybody had these wheels. So initially there were three wheels, and you picked the three wheels, and the only question is what order did you put them in? But after a while they then had five wheels. So they had to make thousands of sets of the same five wheels because they were all made the same way, and then they had to distribute them. And then they went to 8 wheels. So out of 8 wheels, when they were all said and done, out of 8 wheels in this particular Enigma, you had to pick 4 of the 8 wheels, and then you had to put them in the right orientation in the first slot 1, slot 2, slot 3, slot 4, and then there's one more further complicating piece. They had to be aligned at the top with the right number aligned at the very top. So the part of the Cipher paper that went with each unit told the operators that on such and such a day, wheel 1 was oriented with the letter A at the top, letter B at the top, letter C at the top, whatever it was, because that, where it starts, every time you started a message, you had to reset the wheels back to the initial starting place. So all you had to do on Monday is make sure for every message that you sent that day, the wheels were at the starting position. And then the guy at the other end, when he got the message, he would just figure out where the starting position was, and he could take your signal and hit the same letters on his keyboard, and the lights would light up, and it would give him the unencrypted message. And at that point, that's how the system worked. So figuring out how to crack that was really the challenge of the Enigma machine. This is another view of the top, and this is what the plug board looks like. So, as I said, by the time they were done, they had 8 different rotors that they had manufactured. And initially, the operator picked 3, then they picked from 5, and then they picked from 8. So they were always picking 3 wheels, and then they went to a 4-wheel Enigma at some point. Right at the end of the war, they actually had a 5-wheel Enigma, but not for very long. That wasn't used very often. And then the order in the machine mattered, and then the starting position with the letter at the top in the top spot. And then on the front, there's one more thing to explain to you, and that's this plug board. On the plug board, there were all 26 letters of the alphabet, and they gave every operator 10 cables. And every day, the operator had to wire these 10 cables A to, well, let's just say W, D might have gone to P, H might have gone to V. So with 10 cables, that's 20 letters. So 20 letters every day were jumbled, and 6 were not, right? Because there's 26. So if you had hooked up 10 cables, you'd use 20 letters. You had 6 left over. So they had the 10 cables that scrambled 20 of the 26 letters, and that also was set daily. All right. So here's a graphical representation of how it worked. You press the keyboard, the signal goes into that plug board. It might go in as an A and come out as a P. It then goes up into the first wheel, and on this side of the wheel, you might hit the letter A, but actually it transfers through that wheel and it comes out an R. It goes into the next wheel, hits a W, might come out an L. Just depends on the way those wheels were made, because all 8 wheels, every 8th wheel, if it was the number 8 wheel, they were all made the same way. If it was the number 1 wheel, they were all made the same way. But all 8 of them were different, one from each other. And that's how this thing worked. So the signal transferred out through one, and then into the other, and then out there, and then it hit that reflector, and then it doubles the whole thing back again, comes back to the plug board. It might go through another wire, and and back now to the light bulb. So this is how you get to 158 million combinations. Darn complicated. Now, to make it easier for the operators, this is a sample of what they sent out as the information for the operator so he'd know how to set up his machine. This is a sample, and actually it's a bit of a joke. It's from U-571, if anybody remembers that Matthew McConaughey movie where the Americans went to grab the Enigma, which is a fake story. But anyway, it's whoever made this was using that as an example. From January of 1944, secret, so you know, don't tell anybody. And then on the 31st day of January, well, these are the days down here, these are the wheels that you're supposed to pick. So let's just take an example. On the 30th of January of 1944, the operator was supposed to use wheel number 3, wheel number 2, and wheel number 4. And if you look at the numbers here, there's nothing more than 5. So at this point in time, this was a 5-wheel, they had 5 wheels to pick from, right? Here's wheel 5. So then on day 30, they picked wheel 3, wheel 2, wheel 4. And then this next set of digits tells you where it was in terms of the orientation on the top. In this particular case, wheel 1's starting position was number 11. Wheel 2's was number 18, and wheel 3's, well, this wheel 4 here actually, this wheel was set with position 4 at the top, always at the top of the machine. And then you close the lid. So what are these next codes? Well, these next codes, if we can read the German, Stecker, Verben, Düben. German words are always fun to read, by the way. Okay, so you got 10 of these wires. A is hooked to F, by the way, so let's go. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There's 10 of them. A is hooked to F, B to U, C to D, E to K, and so forth. So now this is how everybody set the machine up. And at the start of every message, even if you were going to send, hello, my name is Tony, when you sent the next message, you had to set everything back to the start. Otherwise, you were forever lost. Forget it. You'd never be able to decipher it. So everything had to always be set back to the starting positions with these wheel locations at the top. Always the same wheels on that day. Now, there's one more complicating factor. What if I send you a message on Monday and you don't read it until Tuesday? You have to know the wheel settings for that day. So they had a trick. What they did is they sent in the clear, at the top of the message, they sent a simple 3-letter code. LCX or DMW or HCR or IUG. And that operator told the operator that they needed to use the January 30th settings. Because of course, if they sent SBM on the top of the message, the operator could look through here and see only SBM shows up once, right? And it shows up on the 24th of January. So that's how you knew that you used those code settings for that day. And that is the simple definition of how that machine was put together and how it worked. Now, the story of how we took it apart is much more interesting. On both sides of the Atlantic, everyone who came anywhere near Enigma was required to sign either the Official Secrets Act, if they were in the UK, or in the United States, they were required to sign Top Secret designation. Both required 50 years of silence at the risk of imprisonment or death, and they really meant it. As a result, the story of how we cracked the Enigma was a story that and even the existence of the Enigma remained a secret until long after the war was over. This is one of the true stories from World War II that never truly leaked out. It remained a secret until the end of the Official Secrets Act. For 50 years, nobody talked. No one who worked on the project in the UK or America broke their word. Many went to the grave without ever talking about the fact that they even worked on the project. After the war, Winston Churchill wrote a 6-volume history of World War II. Has anybody read that? Yeah, a few people. For which he won the Nobel Prize. He won the Nobel Prize for that. The word Enigma, or any mention of the secret location at Bletchley Park where all this work took place, doesn't appear in any of the volumes of that 6-volume book. They were petrified that people might find out about the use of the Enigma during the war and how they managed to crack it. The names of anyone affiliated with the project doesn't appear in his book. It's as if it never happened with regards to Churchill's history of World War II. And it turns out there was a very, very good reason for that. And it, of course, comes from their previous experience, which in this case happened in World War I. Just 2 weeks after World War I started, on August the 26th of 1914, a German mine layer, the Magdeburg, was laying mines in the Baltic off the coast of Russia. And it ran aground one night in heavy fog. When the Russians woke up the next morning, they were surprised to look out their windows, and what's out there? There's this German mine layer sitting on the rocks. So they ran out with a boarding party and jumped on board, and much to their great surprise, they found 3 complete German code books for the German Navy. They sent one of those code books to England, and for the entire length of World War I, the Allies were reading the Germans' messages just as quickly as they could intercept the radio transmissions. The Germans never caught on. In England, the code book ended up in room 40 of the Admiralty, the room where the British Codes and Ciphers Department had set up shop. Guess who was the First Lord of the Admiralty at this point during World War I? That's right, Churchill, exactly. So he knew all about this. Even worse for the Germans, when the war started, the British Navy pulled up a German undersea cable that connected Germany direct to the United States so that they could send messages under the ocean, and they cut it. This forced the Germans to send messages back and forth between Washington and Berlin using one of 2 remaining cables, one owned by the Swiss and one owned by the US. And in violation of all agreements, the British tapped both of these cables and started reading the Germans' mail being sent between Europe and North America through the remaining cables. In January of 1917, an officer in that very room 40 of the Admiralty, he walked in and he handed a message that had been intercepted and decoded between the German ambassador to Mexico and the Foreign Office in Germany. And he said to his boss, "Do you want to bring America into the war? And if you do, I've just received the very thing that's a guarantee that we can make that happen." The message that they had intercepted had been sent from a guy named Arthur Zimmermann, a top German civil servant in the German Foreign Office, to the German ambassador in Mexico. And it's become known as the Zimmermann telegram. And here's what it said. Oh, there's a piece I didn't show you. Well, we'll come back to that. Okay, here's what it said. "We intend to begin on the 1st of February unrestricted submarine warfare. We shall endeavor, in spite of this, to keep the United States of America neutral. In the event this does not succeed, we'll make Mexico a proposal of alliance on the following basis: make war together, make peace together, generous financial support, and an understanding on our part that Mexico is to reconquer the lost territory of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. The settlement in detail he's leaving to the ambassador in Mexico. And also, by the way, will you please inform the president of the above most secretly as soon as the outbreak of war with the United States of America is certain, and also add the suggestion that he should, on his own initiative, invite Japan to immediate adherence to, and at the same time mediate between Japan and ourselves," meaning Japan and Germany. "Please call to the President's attention to the fact that ruthless employment of our submarine now offers the prospect of compelling England in a few months to make peace." They're talking about unrestricted submarine warfare, where they were sinking everything in sight. Now, this little telegram, this little ditty, had to get into the hands of the president at the time, but the British had to do it in such a way so that they wouldn't know that the British had been reading the Germans' mail. So the Brits came up with a clever cover story as to how this had come into their possession, and they got it to Woodrow Wilson. Of course, when Woodrow Wilson saw that the Germans were conspiring with Mexico to take over Texas, Arizona, and what was the other state? And New Mexico. Well, you can imagine the reaction. This was actually the precursor to war, and the U.S. entered the war shortly thereafter with virtually unlimited resources. We sent 1 million men to Europe. The Germans, who were already stretched thin by the time our guys got there, were in terrible shape, and by the end of 1918, we all know, in November, the war ended. When the war ended, the boys in room 40, along with the entire Admiralty and Winston Churchill, were pretty proud of themselves. And then they did something really, really stupid. In 1920, both Churchill and the first Sea Lord of the Admiralty, a guy by the name of Sir John Jellicoe, they published books where they described all of this in detail. Not the best idea, because guess who reads books? Karl Dönitz, the Admiral of the German Navy, read those books, and he was shocked. So he set out to make sure it would never happen again. The Enigma machine and the complicated nature of it is the direct result of what happened in World War I. Now, recognizing that loose lips from World War I caused all this trouble in World War II, the British had learned their lesson. So there'd be no discussion whatsoever, none at all whatsoever, about how they cracked the Enigma. Come hell or high water, this story behind cracking the Enigma was going to remain secret, which is why it was never mentioned. And actually, the secret was kept. Beyond swearing everyone to secrecy, every single one of the machines that was so painstakingly built to crack the codes in the UK was destroyed at the end of the war. Every single one. Only one of the machines built and run in the US survived. It was packed in a crate and placed in a huge warehouse in Fort Meade, the home of the US code-breaking efforts since World War II. In England, they even went to the trouble of melting down the machines and even the parts that they had used to make the machines. In the US, they took welding torches to all the remaining machines and cut the metal to bits, and then they took the bits and threw them into a river. Only one set of plans were known to be kept in the US, and one set of plans to be kept in the UK, all locked away. So for nearly 30 years, the secret of Enigma was kept. Only in 1974 did a Captain Winterbotham write a book that tied the activities at Bletchley Park, which no one had even heard of before, by the way, to Alan Turing's work and the 10,000 who cracked the Enigma codes. But Winterbotham, his research did not include any interviews with people who had been at Bletchley. They refused to talk to him. But he had gotten all his information from illegal access to government files in the UK. They prosecuted him for that book and threw him in jail. He spent some time in jail for having written that book, even though the Official Secrets Act was soon to be over. In the 1980s, only after the prescribed 50-year period, the documents in the US and England began to leak out. Pieces of the story began to come out as some of the Bletchley alumni began to talk in public and write books. The Brits eventually turned Bletchley Park into what is now a world-class museum just north of London. If you ever get a chance to go there, it's really quite interesting. But it took years for all of that to happen. And to understand the context of why cracking the Enigma was so important, I want to take you back and put you in the time of when the fight was on and that Britain was fighting for its life during the early part of World War II. After the fall of France, England, as we know, stood alone. The Battle of Britain began and ended before the U.S. was even in the war, right? The Battle of Britain happened even before we were in the war. And it was really the first opportunity that the Allies had to lose the war. Britain had three things, however, going for it that kept that from happening. The first and foremost, the Battle of Britain hinged on the intrepid actions of the RAF Fighter Command, whose fighters were constantly rising up to meet the incoming Luftwaffe threat, and they managed to fly many times 4 or 5 sorties a day, and over a period of 4 months, they were able to deter the German effort. The second factor that was important to the Battle of Britain was radar. The British had an array of stations along the entire coast, which warned the groups of German fighters and bombers that were forming up over France. So they could see far enough away, they could even see into France. That gave the men and women manning these stations time to warn the RAF that the Germans were coming and to give them time to respond. The third factor was the secret decryption of the Luftwaffe's plans, which gave the British the destination for that day's raids. And both the Wehrmacht and the Luftwaffe were using their three-wheeled Enigmas, but they were using them in a rather non-careful way, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. Now, as I said, the machines came with 5 wheels, and the operators selected 3, which they inserted into the machine on any given day. Bletchley was already cracking these codes in 1940. They were a bit lucky in that the radio operators in the Luftwaffe and the Wehrmacht were providing helpful hints. In the summer of 1940, as the wheel settings would change at midnight, in many instances, the new wheel settings were already figured out by 3 a.m., and messages were being regularly decrypted, and the information acted on by 7 a.m. That's pretty darn fast. But the Luftwaffe was very sloppy in the way that they encrypted their messages. The Kriegsmarine, the Navy, was not. And after the Battle of Britain ended, a far more dangerous battle began, the Battle of the Atlantic. And this was a battle that was fought between German U-boats against Allied escort ships and merchant mariners. It began in 1939, but it actually continued in every year that the war carried on. It went on for the entire duration of the war. On the German side, it was fought mainly with U-boats. Germany began World War II with fewer than 30 serviceable U-boats, only 30. Over the next 4 years, they built 842 more, of which we ended up sinking 741. If you were a member of the U-boat Kriegsmarine, the chances of you surviving the war were the worst of any branch of service in the German Army. Of the 35 or 36,000 men in the U-boat service, only about 4,000 managed to live through the end of the war. That's how deadly it became. But it became deadly because we figured out how to hunt them. Allied shipping losses, however, were staggering. More than 2,000 Allied ships were sunk, with more than 80,000 men killed, lost at sea. For Britain to fight the war, everything had to be imported. You know, Britain had no real ability to feed itself. They didn't have enough industrial capacity to make weapons. It all had to be imported. And where was it all being imported from? Over here. Food, fuel, ammo, everything. All had to go by ship. So as the Allies began to plan for the invasion of Europe in 1944, the volume of material that needed to go to Europe was even more. Thousands of planes, thousands of trucks, thousands of artillery pieces, and hundreds of thousands of men all had to transit the Atlantic Ocean in ships under direct peril from these U-boats. And had the Allies lost that battle, there was absolutely no way to win the war. And it's here that cracking the German Enigma ciphers made the biggest difference. The Kriegsmarine gave no extra hints in their messages to help the Bletchley crowd, just a message. And furthermore, the German Navy, when they started working on it, they increased the box of 5 wheels to box of 8 wheels. Now the operator was still picking 3, but they were picking 3 from 8 versus 3 from 5. And this one difference added billions of possible combinations. Churchill, at the end of the war, he wrote in that memoir, the Battle of the Atlantic was the dominating factor all throughout the war. Everything else depended on land, at sea, or in the air, depended ultimately on the outcome. And dominating all our power to carry on the war, or even keep ourselves alive, he wrote, lay our mastery of the ocean routes and the free approach and entry to our ports. So let me talk a little bit, before we get too deep into this, about how we moved material to Europe. It mostly went by ship, and those ships were mostly gathered together in convoys. Because of the U-boat threat, and because escort ships were in such short supply, the Allies tried to send these ships not one by one across the Atlantic, but in large groups of sometimes up to 100 ships. 377 convoys left from Halifax in Nova Scotia, crossing the Atlantic at 9 knots. That's about 12 miles an hour. The ships didn't go exactly very fast. An additional 200 convoys left from a place called Sydney, another town in Nova Scotia that's just north of Halifax. The Sydney convoys were older ships, and they crossed at 6 knots. Can you imagine? You can almost walk at 6 knots. Although many merchant ships were loaded in ports up and down the eastern seaboard of the United States, they were collected together in either Halifax or in Sydney and then sent on their way. A few destroyers would accompany each convoy, and if the convoy was close enough to land, there might be air cover from 1 or 2 bombers. Eventually, we had air bases in Iceland and Greenland, which we flew bombers out of to help cover the convoys. Now, if you visit Churchill's underground war rooms that are situated underneath the Admiralty building in London, which I'll bet many of you have, you'll notice that there's a ginormous map in the underground bunker that tracked the transit of each and every convoy crossing from England to England from North America. And that's not an accident that that map is there, because those convoys were the #1 most important thing that kept Britain in the war. No convoys, no bombs, no guns, no food, no fight. And it was a fight to the death. This is a graph of submarine U-boat losses based on our ability to track their locations from Enigma and our ability to send them to the bottom. And as you can see, over periods of time, we got very good at sinking large numbers of U-boats, but then all of a sudden, we got very bad. Very good, very bad. Very good, very bad. And this is how we ended up sinking 742. The reason we got very bad is because after we figured out how to read the signals, they were changing the way they used their Enigma machines, and Bletchley went dark, and they couldn't figure out what the Germans were saying to each other. So we had to figure out again, every single time, how to crack into the codes again, into the ciphers to be specific, and track down those ships. So that was the cat and mouse game that was going on over the course of the Atlantic. Just in 1 month alone, in March of 1943, 95 merchant ships, nearly 2,000 men, and 567,000 tons of material were sent to the bottom by Dennis's U-boats. That's just in 1 month. They hunted in packs like wolves. They called them wolf packs. And it was as if they were going after sheep, which these convoys really were, because they were just plodding along. They couldn't get away. The U-boats were able to travel faster than they were. And all this chaos was the result that the German Navy was changing the way they employed their Enigma machines, and we were constantly trying to play catch-up to figure it out. When Bletchley could read the German Navy signals, they could make subtle changes to the routes and avoid the U-boat packs. When they couldn't read the signals, the convoys were stumbling into the U-boats with disastrous consequences. The pressure was intense. Crack Enigma, lose the war, or lose the war. For long and repeated periods, as I said, when the Germans were changing features in the way they ran the machines, the U-boats were making hay like there was no tomorrow. There was nothing that we could do to stop them from hunting down those U-boats. There was absolutely no ability to patrol those 100-ship convoys with enough destroyers to protect them from the roving bands of U-boats that were hovering around them. But it wasn't just the Battle of the Atlantic where Bletchley made the difference. Their decrypts helped in many battles throughout the war. Enigma decrypts helped Montgomery in the battle of against Rommel at El Alamein in October of '42. This was the turning point in the fight in North Africa, when Montgomery learned the true and exact locations of Rommel's massed tanks and minefields through Enigma decrypts. When he knew that, he was able to shift his tanks south, and was able to swing around below Rommel and get behind him. Without knowing where they were, they might have stumbled right into the minefields that the Germans had set. But there were also epic failures. Changes in Enigma in late November of '44 kept the Allies from knowing anything about the massing of German armor in the Ardennes. This led directly to the disaster that you all know as the Battle of the Bulge. There are also incidents where the British knew of German attack plans and let the German attack happen anyway. One such case was when they learned of a major German bombing raid aimed at a place called Coventry. Instead of warning the citizens of Coventry to take cover or to head out of town, the British government said nothing and let the raid happen. More than 100 people perished in that raid. The British figured that emptying out the city might tip off the Germans that they were reading the Cipher machines. And then something would change and they'd know nothing. In fact, hiding the source of the information was a big challenge. The Germans, under no circumstance could they be allowed to figure out that the setbacks in the field that they were suffering were the result of the fact that their messages were being read. So much effort went into this deception, and the British were pretty clever about this sort of stuff. In places like Spain and Portugal, countries that were officially neutral during the war, MI6, our OSS, and German agents were constantly playing a game of spy versus spy. And one trick that we used a lot was to let the paranoid Nazis get wind of the fact that we had Allied agents in their midst that were telling us information about what their war plans were. So the Gestapo was constantly being sent running around inside their own ranks looking for spies that never existed. Fake news. And it worked great because the Gestapo literally did spend most of the war chasing their tail in Spain and Portugal. That was a great ruse of obfuscating the role of Bletchley and its codebreakers in outwitting the Germans. The information that came from the Enigma decrypts was extremely tightly held. Only the generals and admirals at the very top levels of British and American armies knew anything about Bletchley, even its existence, and let alone what was going on there. Even its physical existence was closely guarded. Basically, anyone who had any chance of being captured by the Germans was out of the loop. So Patton, forget it, out of the loop. Montgomery, because he was actually in the field, out of the loop. Nobody who was in Europe or in Africa that was in contact with the Germans and possibly able to be picked up as a captured POW was allowed to know the source of the information. Intelligence was always sourced for the generals coming from spies in the German Army, Navy, and Air Force. Never once did they source it from decryption efforts. It was just too dangerous. Now, the first part of how Enigma was cracked comes from the efforts of the Poles. The Poles were busy cracking the Germans' communications codes from the 1920s onwards. But in '28, Suddenly everything changed for the Poles and they couldn't no longer read the German signals. They correctly surmised that the Germans had adopted some sort of a mechanism to make the codes more secure, and it turns out, of course, they were right. The German army had begun using a machine built by a guy named Arthur Scherbius. Now, Scherbius had somehow gotten a hold of some patents and plans of a machine that had previously been designed by people in Holland, and he'd come up with his own ideas, but he's the one who made the machine for the German army, and he's the one who gave it its name Enigma, which in Greek is the word for riddle. Scherbius got the idea from the Dutch, who at one point actually were working with an American company, but nobody managed to commercialize the machine other than this Scherbius guy. He sold it to the German post office, and they used it first for sending encrypted business messages. But from there he made a new version, and he sold that version to the German armed forces. To speed their efforts along, if you're a Pole and you're looking for a quick fix, one of the best things you can do is try to bribe somebody. So the Poles went to a French officer, an intelligence officer, and they asked that French intelligence officer if he would go and bribe a German officer and try and get a copy of the plans and or the machine. So they spent 10,000 Deutschmarks, which is about $1 million in today's money, and he provided, by getting them from a German, a full set of the operating manuals for the three-wheeled Enigma. Now suddenly, the Poles had the wiring diagram that showed them how Enigma worked, just like the wiring diagram I showed you. The Polish code breakers were three guys named Jerzy, now here's Polish names, so we can forget about my correct pronunciation. Jerzy Rzycki, Henryk Zagalski, and another guy named Marian Rajewski. And they were all employed by the Polish General Staff's Cyber Bureau in Washington. Rajewski was pretty smart. And what he did is he took the whole thing further by building a little electromechanical machine to help search for solutions. For some unknown reason that's lost to history, he called it a bomb. Now, why he called it a bomb, spelled B-O-M-B-E, I don't know. Even when I talk to my Polish friends, the word bomb with an E on it in Polish doesn't mean anything in particular anyway. It was like an old-style adding machine that you could imagine, and it had a hand crank on it. You could spin the three wheels on the Enigma machine, and it would light up with a potential solution that yielded clear text when clear text was found. Now, these Poles, because they were so instrumental in all of this, when they ended up in the UK, they ended up with their own memorial at Bletchley. But when the Germans invaded Poland in September of '39, these Polish codebreakers took off one step ahead of the invading German army. They took their Enigma machine, they took their hand-cranked bomb, and they took their plans, and they headed for England. Unfortunately, when they were running for their lives, they had a close call, and they almost got caught. And to avoid being caught, and not wanting to be caught with all this equipment, they ended up destroying it all. So all of their equipment, all of their plans, everything that they had except what was in their heads, they had to ditch. So when they arrived in England, the only thing they arrived with was their clever understanding of how the Enigma worked and what they were able to recreate in terms of wiring diagrams. And here we are. Has anybody been to this place? I know some people have been here. Yeah. So in England, this story now moves to the Government Code and Cipher School, which, by the way, because you took that test, you all now can be employed by those people. It was built by a Jewish guy, a banker named Sir Hubert Samuel Leon back in the 1800s. For some reason, that only he and his wife can ever possibly explain, the house combines Victorian, Gothic, Tudor, Dutch, and even Baroque styles. All of that is in the house. And when you first walk up to the house, you start looking at it and you say, wow, that's ugly. But during the war, some 10,000 people, 75% of the women, worked at Bletchley Park. Kate Middleton's grandmother, a woman by the name of Valerie Glassborough, and her twin sister both worked there. Now, in case you don't know who Kate Middleton is, she's married to Prince William, the future King of England. And if you don't know much about the kings and queens of England and Europe, you know that most of them for many generations were breeding with each other, which had aforementioned, if you think of the guy who was just here before me, he could probably give you an indication of what happens when you inbreed for too many generations. By marrying Kate Middleton, whose mother included someone who worked at Bletchley, the gene pool for the royal family clearly is looking up. Now, Bletchley was known as Station X by those who worked there. Many of the women who worked there were part of the Wrens. That's the British, what the British called the Women's Royal Navy Service. Officially, they were stationed at a place called HMS Pembroke V, or 5. The RAF referred to the place as RAF Eastcott, or RAF Lime Green, or RAF Christ Green. Are you getting the issue here? They got 17 different names for this place, all designed to avoid anybody knowing where it's at. If you got mail, it had to be addressed to room 47 of the Foreign Office in London. The Brits tried every trick they knew to hide its true purpose, and even its existence. Commander Alistair Denniston was the initial head of the operation. Along with him came the key cryptologists that included a guy named John Tiltman, Dilly Knox, and another fellow named Nigel de Grey. These people had a variety of backgrounds. Some were already cryptologists, some were linguists, some were even chess champions. By the way, Nigel de Grey was that World War I officer in room 40 of the Admiralty who walked into his boss's office carrying the decrypted Zimmerman telegram. He ended up working at Bletchley as well. They recruited people who were skilled at crossword puzzles and cryptic games. They resorted to all kinds of crazy tricks. They placed special puzzles in the newspaper and invited people to take the test. If you solved the puzzle, call the number. If you called the number, you'd win a prize. That's what it said in the newspaper. Well, in this case, the prize was a job offer to come to work for the government. But the offer had a catch. You had to sign the Official Secrets Act, which, among other things, was clear. It threatened you with punishment up to and including death for talking out of turn for 50 years. Denniston recognized, however, that the enemy's use of electromechanical cipher machines meant that now he needed formally trained mathematicians. And this is where Alan Turing enters the story. He joined the group from Cambridge on the day the war was declared, so September the 3rd, 1939. The first woman to join and become a full-fledged crypto-analyst was Joan Clark. If you think back to that movie Imitation Game, if you saw it, that was the part played by Keira Knightley. When the Poles showed up with their understanding of the inner workings of the machine, Turing got the idea from the Poles that he could take that bomb that they had built and automate it. It would speed through possible wheel settings and help pick out the ones that yielded a key that unlocked a German message. But now the situation was even more complicated. The Poles had faced an Enigma that had only 3 wheels. But by September of 39, as I said just before, the Germans now had a total of 5 wheels, of which 3 were being selected. And those extra billions of combinations meant that Turing really had his work cut out for him. Now his bomb turned out to be truly a marvel of technology for its day. If you just think about your iPhone, there's more computing power in that iPhone than in every bomb they built times 10. In fact, there's way more computing power in that phone than anything that was used to send men to the moon. But in its day, in 1940, not only was Turing's bomb on the leading edge, it was without a doubt the greatest technological innovation ever devised by man. Now, as I said, at the end of the war, they broke them all up, and all they had left were the plans. Even the tools to build the bombs were destroyed. So after Bletchley was turned into a museum, volunteers started spending a great deal of time there, and they got the idea that they were going to build an Enigma machine. By the way, that machine is the machine that was used in the movie. So when I was at Bletchley, they had just finished building it. And here's how it worked. So before I turn this video on, by the way, if you were an operator sitting next to one of these things, being deaf would clearly have been a great, tremendous benefit, because it's really loud. But these 3 wheels are essentially the 3 wheels on the Enigma machine. And as they spun, they looked for answers. So this machine, this big machine here, is actually holding, these are rows of 12. There's basically 36 Enigma machines turned on their sides trying to decrypt potential signals. Now, when I'm going to turn this on, I don't know how loud it's going to be because I'm not sure what the volume is. So, if you're watching how these wheels spin, this wheel will spin 26 times, and after the 26th time, it'll tick this other wheel 1 tick, and away it goes. And that's how the machine was basically doing the reverse of what the Germans had was doing, and when it came up with a clear text word, it would stop. Okay? Now, that's probably a good time for me to go back to that message that I skipped back here. Let's not skip. That's a good message to talk about. Here it is. Okay, this is what an Enigma message might look like. This is the cipher text. Total gibberish. Absolute gibberish. You wouldn't have, I could sit and spend my life trying to figure out what that meant and I wouldn't have a clue. But using the bomb, they were able to decrypt this information, and then you got a German message. Well, guess what? If you don't speak German, you're in trouble. So you have to also, in addition to knowing what's going on, you also have to have some understanding of German lingo in the German language. So this is the unencrypted clear text message. And if we just parse it into the words, Hung, Mich, Geleit, U4701, on U2338, Kaiser. And if you look, Hung, Mich, see, it's all right there, right? You can see all the words. Even the numbers are written out as text. So dry is 1, 2, 3, 3, ach is 8, and Kaiser, who's Kaiser? Well, it turns out that this message actually says, "am attaching to U4701 convoy," that's what this message says, signed U2338. And the commander of U2338 was a guy named Kaiser. And this Captain Hans Dietrich Kaiser didn't survive the war. This boat was sunk on May the 4th. Wow, that's like 2 days before the war ended, 1945, without scoring any kills. So that's what an decrypted Enigma message came from. And we're going to get to a point where I can show you some of the tricks that they use. But before I do that, I just want to show you a video of that Enigma machine, but only this time. This is the backside. So when I was there that day, as I said, they just finished building this thing, and they were giving people tours of how it worked. This is what it looks like on the backside. That's the top wheel spinning like mad on 3 different roads. And it would stop when a clear text message like hung. It would catch the word hung. That one machine would stop, and then they would know that was a wheel setting that made the word hung show up. Now, how would they do it at that point? Well, every message had to have every letter in the message counted, because with these wheel settings, you had to know how many clicks of that Enigma machine occurred before you started getting the clear text message. But once you knew that the 467th letter was a clear text H, you could back up and you could get the wheel settings for the start of the message. And that's in many cases how they ended up managing to do this. But they had tricks. So in the broadest terms, this bomb worked like a series of Enigma machines in reverse. The spinning wheels were wired to simulate the rotors. To do their work, the British needed special clues, which they called a crib. And a crib was a word or a phrase that the codebreakers suspected as the underlying plain text, like the word hung. And they went looking for that word. The codebreakers not only had to surmise the underlying plain text, but this position of the word within the text message, letter by letter, within that ciphered code. And they devised some tricks, some shortcuts. So let me explain a few of those to you. Okay, a few clues. Well, now remember I said the Luftwaffe and the Army were not particularly careful about what they did. So a lot of Army messages began with the words message number. Okay, now that's a hint, because of course now you're looking for the clear text message number. The Air Force messages often began with "to the group." They had weather ships that they were always chasing down, and those weather ships often sent nothing to report. And here's a weird one: messages often ended with the words "Heil Hitler," which would be great to be patriotic, but not so great when someone's looking to decrypt your messages and looking for clear text words that say Heil Hitler. And if there were just 2 letters, it was HH for Heil Hitler. So there's more. The Germans had weather ships, which they sent to the Arctic to look for approaching weather to Europe. And they often sent reports that said, well, what do weathermen always say? All clear. So if you notice the message that had, well, what's that, 3 and then 5, 8 letters, you could assume that would be all clear. So you could look for decryptions that worked for all clear. Another weather format, winds, south-southwest at 22 knots. Our weathermen who work here in Austin use the same lingo. Well, you can look for those types of words. Another mistake that they made is that when they adopted the 4-wheeled Enigma, they continued to send the same message using a 3-wheeled Enigma. So if you could crack the 3-wheeled version, now you had a way to try to get into the 4-wheeled version. That turned out to be very useful. And the final thing that they did when things were really bad is they did something called a pinch, which I'm going to talk about. So when Turing began designing and building his machine, that started in late 1939. And he knew how he wanted it to work. But he also knew that it would be very helpful if he could get a working Enigma, which the Poles did not bring with them. And more importantly, he really wanted those 5 rotors so that he could see how they were wired Well, where do you get the rotors? Well, you get them from the Germans. You just have to go grab them without the Germans finding out that you got them. If they knew that you were grabbing their rotors, they would say, wait a minute, why do they want these? And they would become suspicious, and the next thing you know, they would stop using the Enigma. So that was the last thing they could allow to happen. So what they did next was quite interesting. Enter into the story MI6, Britain's Foreign Intelligence Service. Already working at Bletchley were 2 people, 2 interesting people. And one of them, you know one of them for sure. Ian Fleming, and another guy I'm sure you never heard of, was Admiral John Godfrey, his boss, were both stationed at Bletchley during the war. Maybe you've heard of them. After the war, as you well know, Fleming became a rather famous author and wrote many books about a fictional British spy. Now Fleming, on the other hand, spent the entire war working for MI6 in naval intelligence, and Fleming and his boss, this John Godfrey character, they took the job of trying to grab usable material and intel from the Germans. They knew the British Navy was often attacking U-boats. On occasion, they knew that U-boats were being forced to the surface by exploding depth charges. At that point, what usually happened was that the hatches on the U-boat would pop open and the men inside the U-boat would come pouring out. Hopefully they'd all get out before the U-boat slipped below the waves. And they got it into their head that, well, maybe before it sank, we could send a British sailor into the sinking U-boat. He could run to the radio room, grab an Enigma machine, the rotors, and whatever else he could find, and then get out before the ship sank. Any volunteers? That doesn't sound too difficult. What could possibly go wrong? Well, in February of 1940, U-33 was trying to sneak into Scapa Flow Naval Base, which is at the north end of the UK, and it crossed paths with a minesweeper, the HMS Gleaner. 2 hours later, U-33 was forced to the surface. Captain Rockman, the captain of the U-boat, told his radio operator, a guy by the name of Becker, no matter what you do, make sure you take that Enigma machine, all the rotors and all the codes, and make sure you throw it into the water. But in the chaos that was ensuing, Becker left the radio room with the wheels of the Enigma in his pants pocket. And when he got out, he forgot to drop them into the water. So he was captured with the rotors still in his pockets. After being hauled onto the Gleaner, a British sailor found them and threw them onto a table because, of course, they were taking everything off of the sailors. Of course, he had no idea what they were. How would he know? He would have absolutely no idea. But luckily, an intelligence officer who picked up those wheels and said, gee, that's an odd-looking thing. He didn't know what it was either. How would he know? Nobody would know what these were for. And, of course, the people at Bletchley weren't telling very many people because the secret had to be kept secret. But he was smart enough to say, gee, this is interesting. I should give this to somebody. Eventually, it made its way to Bletchley and eventually Turing had his 5 rotors. Now, this little trick of grabbing intel from sinking German subs and other vessels was repeated several times during the war, with Fleming and Godfrey coordinating what they called a pinch. In each case, the Germans on the sub who might have seen their Enigma machine or their code books being pinched by the British was either sent to a POW camp or eliminated. There was no way the British were going to let these Germans get back to Germany and tell their friends that the Brits had been after the Enigma machines or the codes. During the war, 3 U-boats and 3 weather ships were all boarded like this. The German weather ships were particularly vulnerable because they had been sent to the North Arctic, the North Atlantic, and the Arctic to cruise around and send radio reports back to Britain, to Germany, about the weather. The British knew these ships were isolated, and they went after them knowing that they were lightly defended. Pinches were reserved only for when Bletchley suddenly lost the ability to decrypt messages due to some technical change in the way the Germans operated the machines. The fastest shortcut, of course, was to go and grab a modified machine in the Cipher books and figure it out from there. The pinches, of course, were dangerous because if the ship under attack radioed back to Germany that the Brits were after the machine, well, the jig was up, and that would have been a disaster. So they were very, very careful. The trick was to make sure the ship being attacked had no time to send a radio message back to Germany. So the first thing they did, fire at the radio mast and knock it out. That meant they decapitated the ability to send messages. To the Germans back in Germany, it appeared that their ships were just disappearing. Not uncommon given the fact that they're floating around in the Arctic, being sunk possibly by anything, up to and including icebergs. They never caught on to the fact that the Brits were pinching their equipment. The secrets at Bletchley were maintained at all costs. Radio communication. There was absolutely no radio communication in and out of Bletchley. All of the wireless intercepts that were made by the British had to be taken to Bletchley. They were taken by courier, by guys on motorcycles who raced around 30 or 40 miles away from Bletchley, where they had the radio antennas, and they would collect the messages and then bring them to Bletchley for transcription. There were also very few telephones on line. Messages arrived at Bletchley by courier, only courier, and that's the only way. Eventually they ended up with 16 different huts and 8 buildings, each with its own special focus. In early 42, the Germans added a 4th wheel to their Enigma machines. Bletchley was in serious trouble. And for much of the second half of the year, Allied shipping losses went straight through the roof. It was a disaster. The Germans, the U-boat captains, if you've ever watched documentaries on the History Channel, they called this the happy times because they were sinking ships with reckless abandon. To grapple the new version of Enigma, the British had begun working on a high-speed 4-wheel bomb, but progress was slow, and even as late as the spring of 42, the British felt they had little hope for success against the trillions of new possible settings. But luckily, by this time, Britain was not alone, and enter into the story now of the U.S. code breakers. The Army's most famous cryptologists were William Friedman and a guy named Leo Rosen. They had, before the war, managed to build a machine that they called Purple, and that machine had figured out how to decrypt the Japanese diplomatic codes. Those secrets were being given around in the United States, and they were called magic intercepts. So they had done a very good job with that. When Rosen and Friedman tried to crack the Enigma codes, rather than building on Bletchley's success, they got sidetracked. They tried to build a machine to crack the Enigma using the same type of equipment that they had used for the Purple machine, and they wasted more than a year. But the Navy also got into the act. They put Meyer Driscoll in charge of their effort, and in October of 1940, she worked non-stop trying to break the Germans' naval codes. For 2 years, she and her team made little progress. She thought she didn't need a machine. Rather, she thought, well, I can just do it manually. And when Alistair Denniston and Dilly Knox came to Washington to advise the U.S. effort in early 42, Driscoll chafed at her superiors, who told her, hey, come on, you should listen to these visiting Brits. Instead, she just continued to power on with her own failing strategy. So the British found themselves in a situation where the U.S. decryption groups that should have been helping them were off chasing their own solutions, while the Brits knew that their bomb worked and their technique was working. As we always say, situation normal, all fouled up. But the Brits had plenty of problems of their own. Turing's bomb was so complex and difficult to build, compounded by the fact that Britain was going bankrupt from the cost of the war as it dragged on. They were not able to build nearly as many of the 3-wheeled bombs that they wanted, and they had absolutely no money to invest in building 4-wheeled bombs. So Knox and Denison had to find a solution. They eventually enlisted Churchill, who listened to their story. He eventually was able to convince FDR to get involved, and FDR did the one thing FDR was very good at during the war. He put somebody in charge. So he ended up putting a guy named Joseph Wenger from the Navy in charge. He was a rear admiral. And this guy, you should just think of him as a Navy version of General Groves. His job was to find a way to build bombs in the U.S. to help the British crack the codes and stop the Germans from sinking all those ships that the Americans had been building. His first action was to send the top cryptographers in the country where? He sent them, he said, you are going, pack your bags, you're going to England. And he made them stay at Bletchley until they could come home with a full understanding of the British technique for how they were deciphering the messages and how the bombs were working. And at the same time, he opened up a decryption effort in a new building that they had just taken over on Nebraska Avenue in Washington. Now enter the story, the guy that really saved the day. Wenger hired National Cash Register, the people who make ATMs today, in Dayton to construct the U.S. bombs. The man put in charge of the effort was an engineer, a guy by the name of Joe Desch. Eventually, he had 800 U.S. Navy men and 200 civilians, all working at NCR, all building and operating the American bombs. As in the UK, the Americans were sworn to secrecy. Many died, as I said before, without ever revealing their wartime activities, including Joe Desch himself. It was Desch's daughter, a woman by the name of Debbie Anderson Desch, who really brought the whole NCR role of this into the public eye, and that was only in the 1990s, long after her father had passed away in 1972. Debbie was digging through her father's papers and she found references to Building 26 at NCR. She had no idea what this was all about, but she also found pictures of her father surrounded by dozens of Navy men. She thought to herself, wait a minute, Dad worked at NCR during the war. What are these Navy people doing there? And even worse was he found pictures of him with 200 women, all dressed in women's uniforms. And that really got her head scratching. They were all sitting in front of a place called Camp Sugar. And Camp Sugar, it turns out, was the place where these Navy women were stationed. That's where they lived, up in the hills above Dayton. So, not really knowing what she found, where did she go? She went to talk to the archivist at NCR. She walked in to talk to he made an appointment, goes to talk to the archivist at NCR, and what does the archivist tell her? After looking around, the archivist comes back and says, I have no idea what you're talking about. So she left not knowing anything. Eventually, actually, she ended up at Fort Meade. Finally, a historian at Fort Meade in Washington clued her into the story, and that was how the story started to leak out. But her dogged pursuit of her father's story has led to a number of books on NCR's role in the Enigma story, and she maintains a website also today that gathers information about the people who worked there and the role that they had, as well as the role of her father. Joe Desch initially asked for 200 people to help him because he needed them to make 11,000 of those rotors. So the Navy supplied him with waves, the women. And the women, when they showed up, they were asked to complete a series of sewing tests, which he wanted to see whether or not they could make these intricate connections. It turns out the interconnections that he was trying to get them to see if they would make were in fact the connections on the rotors. George Meade, the top Navy man assigned to Desch's project, told them that if they were accepted into the program, their work would shorten the war. He said that they'd be required to sign a secrecy document, and he said that if they violated it, it would mean imprisonment or death. So these women all ended up joining NCR, and with their efforts, Desch was able to make significant improvements to the British design. He built first a 3-rotor machine before it went in production all over. Desch was already building a 4-rotor machine. He was an electromechanical genius, and he was able to build on Turing's work in a way that Turing could only imagine. In England, Bletchley built 50 3-rotor bombs in 1942 and another 25 in 1943. NCR built 150 3-rotor bombs in 15 months starting in August of 42, and then they built 250 4-rotor machines beginning in 1943, and then continuing into the first 6 months of 44. The British were so impressed at what the Americans were doing, they just said, forget it. Just send us bombs that you're building. So after that happened, NCR really kicked into high gear. Of the 150 3-rotor machines that they built, 75 ended up in Bletchley. Of the first 250 4-rotor machines, half of them went to Bletchley, and the other half went to Washington. Before those were even built, the government bought 400 more. Those were split 50-50. By the time they were done, NCR was building 6 of them every single day. They only stopped making them in early 45 when there were so few U-boats left to sink that there was no reason to be making any more bombs. That's when they stopped. Now, this is what it looked like. Now, there's only one of these machines left in Fort Meade. And this is a picture of what it looked like, much bigger than the British machine. But as you can see, look, 1, 2, 3. This is a 4-wheel bomb. And these 2 wheels are for the plug board at the top. That's what that is. And that's a woman, that's some gal standing in front of it. Let me show you a little video. Whoop.
They were operated in the greatest secrecy and service women from the special centers in Washington.
We were assigned to a building, 2 stories, and in the building, on each floor, were approximately 60 of these machines. And we were taught to run them. They gave us a graph to follow, and we would set these switches, certain numbers. And then came down here to set the rotor wheels, and I realized these were the wheels we were putting together in Dayton, Ohio. So we would put the settings to the numbers. There's a little clip. You unclip it, pull the wheel out, and set it to the number, then push it back in, and put it in place. When all the switches were set to the proper numbers, and all the wheels were set, came over here and pushed the button. Then we sat on a stool at the end of the machine, or in the run, what we call run. When the message was broken, all of these lights would flash, and then the machine would stop. And at that point, we would print. When it was finished printing and the machine started up again, we would tear it off and rush to the end of the room, knock on the door, the hand would come out and we would say, strike. The hand took the message away, you never saw it again. You couldn't read the message because it was in columns of letters. So apparently, when they took away, it went somewhere.
How long did that go on?
That went on for 2 years, and we kept these machines going night and day.
Were there times when you were getting like special emergency messages?
So they never stopped.
Yes.
The effort never stopped, 24/7 for 2 years. One interesting thing about the U.S. effort, unlike the British, where the people in one hut were talking to the people in the other hut, and everybody generally knew what they were doing, the American effort was totally compartmentalized. As you heard that, Del, she had no idea what she was doing, absolutely no clue. And when they handed the information to the next person in line, they had no idea what that person was doing with that information. In fact, they didn't even know that they were cracking codes for the Enigma machine. They were really kept in the dark. Now, by early 1945, the code breakers were sharing so much information between each other that they were sharing on the order of 30 or 40 cribs a day. And literally every German message was being hacked within 10 or 15 minutes of it being received either in the United States or at Gleichschule. And that brings us back to Alan Turing. Poor old Alan Turing. He was an odd duck. He lived in Cambridge, and when his allergies acted up, which must have been like living in Austin, he wore a gas mask while he pedaled his bike to work 15 miles between Cambridge and Gleichschule. So he looked quite funny when he was doing that, but he was brilliant. After the war, he started thinking about artificial intelligence and whether or not a machine could ever be made to think like a human. Well, that's interesting. He wrote a paper in 1950 entitled Computing Machinery and Intelligence. He hypothesized something called the imitation game, where he posed the question, can machines think? But Turing had a secret. He was gay at a time when governments prosecuted people for being gay, and he was fired because they felt he was a threat to national security. Arrested and prosecuted for indecency, he eventually accepted treatment for his disease and agreed to take hormone injections which left him unhappy and impotent. In 1954, he took his own life by injecting an apple with cyanide and taking a bite. But that is not the end of the story. Turing's work eventually came to the attention of someone quite famous in tech circles in California. Someone who also wrote papers on machine intelligence and dabbled in artificial intelligence. Most of you may know one of his products. In fact, most of you may own one of his products. Steve Jobs would never acknowledge that Apple's logo had a link to Turing, but Jobs never gave credit to anyone for anything. He was a real character. He was known to be difficult, to say the least. Anyway, you can decide for yourself if this apple with a bite out of it has a reference back to Alan Turing, who injected cyanide into an apple and took a bite out of it to commit suicide. Now, today, I told you something interesting happened today. Today, I was looking for some theme music for today, and I found this music that had come from the Imitation Game. I want to play it for you again. That was the music they used for the Imitation Game. All right. Oop. Now I want to play you the music that Apple used when they launched their latest product, the Apple. Actually, it was the Apple 8. See if you notice something. Can you hear the similarity? Yeah? So I think what happened, what I just found today by accident, was somebody at Apple sort of saying, yeah, well, the music from the Imitation Game, we kind of used it a different kind of format, a different style, but it's the same music. Maybe they're giving a tip of the nod to the fact that logo really did come from touring. Anyway, it's up for you to decide. Okay, that's it.
We have some time here.
This is really just kind of a comment. You mentioned the Polish. There's a book that came out, I believe it was just this year. It's called Last Hope Island. And-
That Last Hope Island?
Yes.
Okay.
It's about all of the governments who went in exile to Britain
Oh,
during the war, including all the Polish.
yeah.
And that she makes an argument, the gal's name is Lynn Olson. She makes the argument that the British didn't really give the Poles enough credit.
I was just going to say that they never let those 3 Polish code breakers work at Fletcher, which was a real shame. You know, who knows what accomplishments they might have achieved with those guys. But they thought they were enemy aliens, they weren't to be trusted, it was the nature of the time. Yes, that's true, right, right.
Question here?
Oh, sorry, yeah.
I actually have 2 questions. First, on the Enigma machine itself, what was the purpose of was it reflector or
Yeah.
reflection?
It just doubled the probability, so. it's-
Double, okay, that's
That's
what I was
the
saying.
sole purpose, was just to, where's there, was just, once the signal made it to the end, now you had to go all the way back through the wheels again.
Okay.
Yeah.
The second question is, I assume that the Germans never cracked our codes, otherwise if we had tried to send Marty the information about where the German troops were in El Alamein, the Germans would have intercepted that.
Well, you'd be wrong about that. Unfortunately, the people who were working on decrypting Enigma were not involved with the people who were making our own codes, which were being hacked all the time. It was a real problem during the war, and a lot of bad things happened as a result of our codes being cracked. The British did a slightly better job, but if they'd have put half as much effort into making our codes as secure as the Germans had, we'd have had a much better outcome. But in fact, there's a lot of sad stories about our own efforts to how we were running our encryption during the war.
Is there any validity to the story that we used the language of an Indian tribe as a code during the war?
So in the Pacific, so we were fighting the Japanese in the Pacific, not the Germans, but the Japanese people had no ability to understand the language of Native Americans. So the United States ended up hiring Navajo Indians to work as code talkers, they called them code talkers, to transmit information from the ships to the beach by radio. The Japanese could listen in. Remember the story I told you about everybody being able to listen in? But when the Japanese heard 2 people who were Navajo talking, it sounded like gibberish. They had no clue. They would just look at each other and say, well, I don't know. And they gave up. So the Navajo code talkers were quite effective in terms, but that was only on the battlefield. That was just for battlefield communication.
So you said that the German messages were decoded in 15 minutes and might have happened in the U.S. How did the messages get to?
Undersea cable. So in order to keep anything from being, remember those cables I told you about? Everything was being transmitted back to England, back and forth by cable, not by radio. So that way they knew the Germans weren't even able to listen in, even if they wanted to, because those cables started here and they ended in the UK. They weren't tapped by the Germans.
I just wanted to mention another book. It's been out recently called Winston Churchill and the Ungentlemanly Art of War. It was pretty interesting about a lot of their intelligence going during the war.
What's it called again?
Winston Churchill's Ungentlemanly Art of War.
Okay, thank you. Sounds appropriate. Yes.
Well, I've got a bunch of comments, and just tell me to shut up when I've gone on. Going back to the very beginning of the story, Sherbius filed a U.S. patent on the Enigma machine.
Yes.
So the U.S. and the Brits, everybody knew how the Enigma machine worked. It was just how to crack the messages.
So I pulled up that patent after we talked about that last week, and it is not the same machine that he sold to the German.
Minus the plug board.
Yes, it has some differences, that's right.
But the early part of the espionage work to get the original German code books and the original Enigma wiring settings is really interesting. There was a fellow by the names of Hans Thilo Schmidt who was paid off by the French to convey that information to the French intelligence service. Hans Thilo Schmidt was the brother of the head of communications in the German army. So he betrayed his own country to sell that material, and he
Well, he was
basically...
well paid, he got a 10,000 Deutschmark, which I guess
Yeah,
is like a
and
million.
his brother, out of the kindness of his heart, had given him a job.
Well,
And that's how he got access to it.
I have a brother just like that.
And anyway, that information went to the French. The French offered it to the British back in the 30s. The British turned it down. The Poles then took it. The Poles made the early breakthroughs on Enigma. The way the Enigma machine was used early on was different than the way it was used later in the war. Initially, they only used 6 cables on the plug board instead of 10.
So let me get to a few more questions and then we'll come back.
Okay, let somebody else talk.
Any questions?
Oh,
Good, continue.
all right, we'll carry on then. There's no more questions. Go ahead.
Well,
Oh.
before he does, I want to share just a quick example of how committed the Brits were to their silence. When we were in Bletchley Park, they told us about the reunion that they had, perhaps after the 50th reunion, of 50 years. And a husband said to his wife, you know, I worked at Bletchley Park and I want to go to that reunion. And she said, so did I. I'll go to the reunion with
You know, to follow up with that.
Well, wait a minute. If you know a lot of British people, you'll realize that a husband and wife not sharing something like that with each other for 50 years is pretty normal. Had it been something about one of their pets, they would never have been able to keep a secret. But if it was about themselves or their children, no problem, they could keep the secret.
Our experience was there, among all the different buildings, the small buildings where everybody worked, no one knew where anybody worked. It was all done with these manual types of conveyor belts that you shove papers and booklets between buildings. You never knew who received it, you never knew who sent it. It was all manual, and so no one knew anybody.
They were petrified that the Germans would find out. It was such a valuable tool that they were petrified. There's been a lot of stories that come out since the war, and I've read a lot of crazy books about people who landed on the beaches of France to grab an Enigma machine and take it back to the UK. All nonsense. They were so petrified. They would never let anybody out of the country and go to France if there was even the slightest chance that they might be captured by the Germans, because being captured by the Germans would have been the end of everything. It was really the most tightly held secret of World War II. Way more tightly held than the talk last week about the atomic bomb. You know, the Russians knew everything about the bomb almost as fast as we were building it. Klaus Fuchs and Ted Hall, the other guy who came from Columbia, were spreading that information as fast as they could get their hands on it. Yeah.
There was a movie about the Enigma machine and its monitoring. I haven't seen it yet, but I have a question. Have you seen the movie? And do you think it was reasonably accurate?
It's a Hollywood movie. Go enjoy it. Go enjoy it. You'll see that machine is in the movie. There's a few things that are generally correct. Yes, it was at Bletchley Park. Yes, they were cracking the Enigma codes. But, you know, it showed Joan, whatever her name was, Clark, as the love interest for Alan Turing. You know, this is nonsense. Just made up nonsense. Hollywood stuff to make it work.
Hollywood stuff. Well, there was also a British series about.
Yes, there was, I saw that on Netflix or somewhere, that's more accurate.
Okay, I thought it was quite.
Yes, yes, that's more accurate than the movie. But the movie's fun to watch anyway, because it does tell the story, there's nothing wrong with it. It's just Hollywood.
Any more questions? Well, thank you very much, Richard. We'll look forward to next week.
Next week, we're talking about the Nuremberg war crimes trial.